You think you know someone, until they surprise you in the worst possible way. Michael Turner sat quietly at the edge of the courtroom, his eyes fixed on the divorce papers in front of him. Rachel, his wife of 15 years, sat across from him, signing her name with a smug grin. "I'm doing this for both of us," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Michael didn't respond. He just stared at her, wondering when things had changed so drastically. Their life had been perfect, or so he thought. A beautiful house in the suburbs of Los Angeles, 2 kids, vacations every summer, and everything anyone could wish for. He had worked tirelessly in the financial sector, building a comfortable life for his family, but something had been off for a while. He had noticed the late nights, the lack of communication, the coldness. But he never imagined it would come to this. Rachel had been distant for months, always busy with work, but this was different. She had already planned everything. The divorce papers were a shock, but not as much as the words she spoke as she signed them. "You've failed me," she said, the words cutting deeper than anything he could have imagined. "Your investments, your career, it's just not enough anymore. I'm done." She laughed, as if this was some kind of game. Michael didn't react. He had learned long ago not to show his emotions in front of Rachel. He kept his composure, knowing that the truth was coming. The judge then began reading through the documents, listing Michael's assets and investments. Rachel's laugh faded as the numbers were announced. "Michael Turner has a net worth of $250 million, including real estate holdings, stocks, and investments." The room fell silent. Rachel's smile faltered, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What?" she gasped, her voice cracking as she glanced at Michael, who remained calm, his expression unreadable. The judge continued, explaining that the assets were untouchable. Rachel's world had just crumbled in front of her eyes. The shock on her face was priceless. Michael had stayed quiet, letting her think she had the upper hand. But he knew this moment was coming. He had been preparing for this, silently building his wealth while she spent her days distracted by her own desires. He had never wanted this to happen, but now that it was, he was ready. He had worked hard for everything he had, and Rachel would not take it from him. As the judge slammed the gavel down, sealing the divorce, Michael stood up. He didn't say a word. He just walked out of the courtroom, leaving Rachel behind. She had thought she could walk away with everything, but Michael had just shown her that she was wrong. Michael stepped out of the courtroom, his heart beating steadily, not in anger, but in quiet relief. The weight of the moment was heavy, but it was a weight he could finally bear. The world outside felt different somehow, brighter, even though the sky was overcast. He wasn't free yet, but the first step had been taken. His eyes stayed fixed on the door, his mind still racing. The scene in the courtroom kept replaying in his head. The disbelief on Rachel's face, the shock in the eyes of everyone else in the room as the judge read his net worth. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her look so vulnerable. For so many years, she had been the one in control. She had held the reins in their marriage, dictating what was important, what mattered. But now, the power had shifted. She had underestimated him. She had assumed that because he was quiet, because he wasn't always flaunting his success, he didn't have the strength to stand up for himself. That was her mistake. Michael wasn't the man he had once been. The man who had let himself be walked over, who had been willing to sacrifice everything to please her, was gone. In his place stood a man who had worked tirelessly, quietly building a life for himself. A man who had earned his place, who had made his fortune, all while she took him for granted. Michael knew what he had to do next. He had to rebuild his life, not just for himself, but for his children too. As he drove away from the courthouse, he made a promise to himself. No more lies, no more pretending. Rachel would never see him as weak again. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming his dignity. The divorce wasn't just an end, it was the beginning of something new. As he pulled into his driveway, Michael took a deep breath. His house, the home he had built for his family, stood before him like a fortress. It was time to make it his again. As he entered through the front door, the emptiness of the house hit him. Rachel's things were still there, her clothes in the closet, her books on the shelf, but it all felt distant now, like someone else's life. The silence was deafening. He walked through the house, touching the walls, remembering the life they had once shared. But that life was over. The realization settled in. He wasn't the same man anymore. He wasn't the man who had stayed up late worrying about bills, who had tried to please a wife who no longer cared. He was someone different, someone stronger, Michael wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never let anyone, not even Rachel, make him feel small again. And as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, he made one final vow. He would rise from this, stronger and more determined than ever before. Michael woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The fog that had clouded his mind for so long had lifted, replaced by a sharp focus. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Rachel's betrayal define him. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of a man who had been broken but was now rebuilding himself piece by piece. The man who had been quiet, who had let his wife control the narrative, was gone. In his place stood someone who was ready to take control of his own life. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his lawyer. The assets are secure. We'll move forward as planned. Michael nodded to himself, knowing that everything was falling into place. The battle was far from over, but he was prepared. Rachel had always believed that she could manipulate the situation, that she could walk away with everything while he was left with nothing. But now, the tables had turned. The assets, the investments, the properties, everything he had worked for, were no longer just numbers on a paper. They were his to protect, his to build upon. As he sat down to his computer, Michael took a moment to reflect on the years he had spent building his empire. Long hours at the office, missed family dinners, weekends spent in front of spreadsheets instead of with his children. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He wasn't about to let Rachel take it all away. Over the next few days, Michael began to put his plan into motion. He met with his lawyer, sorted through the necessary paperwork, and began to solidify his next steps. He didn't need Rachel's approval anymore, didn't need her validation. He had everything he needed to move forward. But as he walked through his house, taking in the empty spaces where memories once lived, a part of him still ached. He had loved Rachel, truly. But love wasn't enough when it was one-sided. It wasn't enough when you gave everything and received nothing in return. Michael knew that he deserved more. He deserved respect, not mockery. He deserved someone who would stand beside him, not someone who would tear him down for their own gain. The days turned into weeks, and as Michael began to focus on his future, he realized something important. This wasn't just about money or assets. It was about reclaiming his life. The financial success was just a part of it. The true victory was in regaining his sense of self, in knowing that he had the power to shape his own destiny. And while Rachel was out there, perhaps planning her next move, Michael wasn't worried. He had already won. The next chapter of his life had already begun, and this time, he would write the story. No more playing second fiddle, no more being the afterthought. This was his time to shine. Michael woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was still early, the sun barely peeking through the curtains, but his mind had already been racing for hours. The divorce was final, but the work wasn't over. He could feel the shift in his life, a sense of purpose taking root. The past few weeks had been a blur of meetings with his lawyer, sorting through the remains of his marriage, but now it was time to focus on something new. Michael knew he had to rebuild, not just his financial empire, but himself. It had been too long since he had taken a moment to think about what he wanted. No more compromising, no more being second to Rachel's needs. It was his turn now. He grabbed his phone and checked his messages. There were a few from friends, offering support, but one stood out. It was from his old college buddy, Tom. "Hey man, let's catch up. I heard about everything. Maybe it's time to invest in something big." Michael smiled at the message. Tom had always been the one to push him to take risks, to think outside the box. Michael hadn't been ready for those risks in the past, but now, with the weight of his old life finally lifting, he felt ready. He called Tom back, and after a brief conversation, they agreed to meet later that day. The meeting went better than Michael had expected. Tom had a vision, an idea for a startup that could revolutionize the tech industry. Michael's mind raced as they spoke, the wheels turning faster than they had in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt the spark of excitement. This was his chance to do something for himself, to take control of his future. The thought of Rachel's mocking laughter, the way she had belittled him in front of the judge, suddenly didn't seem as important. What mattered now was building something that was entirely his own. As the day went on, Michael met with investors, made plans, and began to see a future that was his to shape. By the time the evening rolled around, he felt a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't felt in years. He had already started to turn the page, and the future looked promising. That night, as he sat alone in his office, reviewing the proposals and contracts, he realized just how far he had come. He wasn't the man he had been a few months ago. He was stronger, more confident, and more focused than ever before. The journey wasn't going to be easy, but Michael knew he had the tools to make it work. The pain of the past would always be there, but it wouldn't define him anymore. As he closed his laptop and stood up from his desk, Michael felt a surge of pride. He had made it through the hardest part, and now, with his future in his hands, there was nothing that could stop him. Weeks passed, and Michael felt like a new man. The spark he had been missing for so long was now burning brightly, and he knew he had to keep the momentum going. The startup idea with Tom had turned into something bigger than he could have imagined. They had secured initial investors and were in the process of finalizing their first major deal. For the first time in years, Michael felt like he was in control again. His days were filled with meetings, brainstorming sessions, and strategy planning. The work was hard, but it felt fulfilling. His mind was constantly racing with ideas, and he found himself looking forward to the challenges ahead. One evening, as he reviewed some documents at his office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. "I need to talk," it said. Michael paused, his hand hovering over the phone. He hadn't heard from her since the divorce. She had left, and he had moved on. But curiosity got the best of him. He decided to respond. "What is it?" he typed. Within minutes, she replied. "I know we haven't spoken much, but I've been thinking about what happened. I just wanted to apologize for everything." Michael stared at the screen. Apologize? After everything? The words stung, but they didn't have the same power they once did. He had moved past this. He had built something new, something he was proud of. He thought about the years of neglect, the way she had belittled him, the way she had laughed when she signed the divorce papers. The apology didn't matter anymore. It was too little, too late. Michael sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. But he was done. He realized that no matter what Rachel said, he could never go back to the person he had been. That person was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more determined, and more focused. He knew what he had to do. He had to keep moving forward. The next day, he met with Tom again. They finalized the plans for their startup and agreed to scale up faster than they had initially planned. Michael felt the weight of his decision settling in. This was his new path, and nothing, not Rachel, not his past, was going to get in the way. As they discussed their next steps, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had fought for this. He had fought for his future. And now, it was finally within his grasp. When the meeting was over, Michael walked out of the office with a sense of purpose. He was no longer defined by his past. He had rewritten his story, and it was only just beginning. The future was his to shape, and he was ready. Michael sat at his desk late one evening, the quiet of the office surrounding him. His startup was starting to take off, and things were moving faster than he had ever imagined. But even with all the success he was building, his mind kept wandering back to Rachel. It had been weeks since she'd sent that message, and he hadn't responded. He had no reason to engage with her anymore. She had made her choices, and he had made his. Still, there was something nagging at him, a feeling that wouldn't go away. It wasn't guilt, it was a need for closure. Michael picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer. "Give me the final paperwork for the divorce settlement. I want to make sure everything is squared away." He needed to know that there was nothing left that could tie him to her. He had done the work to move on, but there were still loose ends to tie up. The conversation was brief, and his lawyer promised to send the documents by the end of the week. Michael hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline outside. He had built a life for himself, but the echoes of the past were still there, lingering like shadows in the corners of his mind. He had worked so hard for everything he had, but in the end, it felt hollow without the right people to share it with. He wasn't looking for love again, not yet, but he had learned a valuable lesson. He would never let anyone control his life again. Not Rachel, not anyone. The next morning, Michael met with Tom again, discussing their future plans for the business. Tom was optimistic, pushing for even bigger goals, but Michael's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the future, not just professionally but personally. He had sacrificed too much for too long. He had neglected the people who had supported him, his friends, and even his children. It was time to make a change. He wasn't going to let work consume him. Again, not the way it had in the past. As Tom outlined his next big move, Michael zoned out for a moment, looking around the room. The walls were lined with achievements, plaques, and awards, symbols of everything he had worked for. But none of it meant anything if he wasn't happy. He had spent so many years chasing success, and now, he realized he needed to chase something else, balance. He excused himself from the meeting early, telling Tom he needed some time to think. He walked outside, feeling the weight of the decisions ahead. As he drove home, Michael made a promise to himself. He would spend more time with his children, reconnect with old friends, and, most importantly, he would live for himself. The past was behind him, and it was time to focus on what truly mattered. When he arrived home, he walked through the front door, the familiar silence of the house greeting him. It felt different now, somehow. It was no longer a place of conflict. It was his space, and he was going to make it a home again. Michael knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He had everything he needed to start fresh, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The days passed, and Michael's life continued to transform. His business was booming, his confidence was growing, and he was starting to feel like he was finally living life on his own terms. But something still lingered in the back of his mind, a nagging thought that he couldn't shake. It was Rachel. After everything, she was still a part of his thoughts, even if just a small part. He knew he was past the anger, past the resentment, but there was still a sense of unfinished business, a need for closure, for finality. One evening, Michael sat on his balcony, looking out at the city skyline. The view was stunning, but it didn't quite fill the emptiness he still felt inside. He realized that no amount of success or wealth could replace the connections he had lost along the way. He had spent so many years focused on his career, building his empire, that he had forgotten to nurture the relationships that mattered most. He thought about his children, the way they had grown up so fast. He thought about his old friends, the ones he had drifted apart from because he had been too busy. And he thought about Rachel. Their marriage had ended, but the impact it had on his life was still being felt. He picked up his phone and sent her a simple message. "We need to talk. It's time." Michael sat back, his heart pounding. He had no idea what she would say, but he knew this was something he had to do. He couldn't move forward without facing the past. The next day, Rachel replied, "I'm free this afternoon. Let's meet." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop, a neutral place where they could talk without distractions. Michael arrived early, his mind racing. He hadn't seen Rachel in months, and he wasn't sure what to expect. Would she still try to manipulate the situation? Would she apologize again, as she had done before? Or would this be the final chapter in their story? When Rachel arrived, she looked different. She was still beautiful, still confident, but there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She sat down across from him, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again," she said quietly. Michael took a deep breath, looking her in the eyes. "We've both moved on, Rachel, but we need to clear the air. For both of our sakes." The conversation that followed was difficult, but necessary. They talked about the mistakes they had both made, the things that had gone wrong in their marriage. Michael listened as Rachel expressed her regrets, but he didn't feel the same anger he had once felt. Instead, he felt a sense of peace. He had nothing left to prove to her. He had done the work to heal, to grow, and to move forward. And in that moment, he realized that this was the final step. There was nothing left holding him back. He could truly move on. As they parted ways, Rachel gave him a small, almost apologetic smile. Michael didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. He simply nodded and walked away, feeling lighter than he had in years. He wasn't holding on to the past anymore. The future was waiting for him, and he was ready to face it. Michael stepped into his office the following Monday, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The conversation with Rachel had been tough, but it had given him the clarity he needed. He wasn't just moving on from her anymore. He was leaving behind a version of himself that no longer served him. As he sat at his desk, looking at the plans for the future of his startup, he realized that his success wasn't just about the business. It was about reclaiming his life, his identity, and his freedom. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Tom. "Hey, I've got a new investor lined up. Big player in the tech industry. We need to move fast." Michael leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the decision ahead. Everything he had built was about to grow exponentially, and he had to be ready. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady. "But we need to focus on what really matters. We're not just building a company, we're building a legacy." Tom agreed, and they made plans to meet later that week. As Michael hung up the phone, he felt a surge of excitement. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was his confidence. He had fought too hard to let this slip away. That evening, Michael took a walk through his neighborhood, the cool night air refreshing after a long day. He hadn't taken time for walks in months, always consumed by the demands of work and the ghosts of the past. But tonight, something felt different. The stars seemed brighter, the streets quieter. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. As he walked, he thought about his children. He had been so focused on his work that he had missed out on their growing up. He hadn't been the father he wanted to be. But that was about to change. He was going to be more present, more involved. His kids deserved that, and so did he. When he returned home, Michael sat down with a notebook and began to write. He made a list of everything he wanted to achieve, not just in business, but in life. Family, health, happiness, things he had once taken for granted. He realized that his journey wasn't just about achieving success anymore. It was about balance. It was about creating a life that he could be proud of, not just in the eyes of the world, but in his own eyes. The following weeks flew by in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. But this time, Michael wasn't consumed by it all. He had learned how to balance his ambition with his personal life. He had learned to take care of himself, to set boundaries, and to make time for the things that truly mattered. By the time the year came to a close, Michael stood on the rooftop of his office building, looking out at the city below. He had achieved more than he ever thought possible, but more importantly, he had found peace within himself. The past was no longer a weight around his neck. He had let go of the bitterness, the anger, and the regret. And for the first time in a long time, he felt free. Michael stood at the edge of his office balcony, watching the city come alive with the lights of the evening. It had been a year since the divorce, a year since his life had taken a turn he never saw coming. He had been through the darkness, the hurt, and the uncertainty, but now, standing here, he could finally see the light. His startup had taken off beyond his wildest dreams, his financial stability was secure, and his relationships with his children had grown stronger than ever. Michael had learned to balance ambition with personal happiness, and for the first time, he felt at peace. But even with all the success, there was still one thing left that he needed to do: take control of his future on his own terms. He knew that moving forward was the only option, but this time, he wasn't going to let the past dictate his choices. He had worked too hard for too long to let anyone, especially Rachel, take that away from him. As he watched the city below, he realized that it wasn't just about the money or the business anymore. It was about freedom. Freedom to live life on his own terms. Freedom to make choices without fear of judgment or failure. Over the past year, he had learned that success wasn't just about what you had, but about who you became in the process. He had transformed from a man who was once overshadowed by others into someone who now stood on his own, with no apologies and no regrets. Michael smiled to himself, knowing that his journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. He had everything he needed now to build the life he wanted. He wasn't going to waste any more time looking back. He had learned to leave behind what didn't serve him, and now he was going to embrace everything that lay ahead. As the night sky grew darker and the lights of the city sparkled like stars below, Michael felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had fought hard for this moment, and now he could finally say that he had won. Not just the battle, but the war. He was finally free.